very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
If a man rejects truths that are undeniably evident, it is no easy task to find arguments that will change his mind. This 2,000-year-old quote from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus makes clear that human nature has not changed. Ideology, bias, and preconceptions still rule the day. And sadly, verifiable facts are all too often irrelevant to most. Normalcy bias and comfort zones are their mindset of choice. Welcome to the Global Alert News Hour with stories that you didn't want to hear and probably don't want to know. But the Global Alert News Hour is about verifiable frontline facts, not ideology, preconception, or program bias. The frontline facts are not pleasant, not reassuring, but if we're to have any chance of altering the current course toward certain planetary omnicide in which we are currently headed, we must all dig deep and summon the courage to see the world through a clear lens. This is Dane Wigington with the weekly edition of Global Alert News Hour for June 10th, 2017. As always, this is a commercial-free news hour brought to you by Geoengineeringwatch.org. This show is broadcast on KQMS throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM. The Global Alert News Hour is also aired on the East Coast by the PRN Radio Network. My thanks to Gary Knoll for his help making that happen and helping us to get the word out on the most critical issues. That show airs on the East Coast at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Recordings of the show can be found at geoengineeringwatch.org under the Top Stories, Recent, and Radio sections and at the KQMS archives. As always, I announce every week Orchard Nutrition in Redding, if you're in the Shasta County area. Free informational materials, critical materials, if you'll simply promise to put those materials to use. We do our best to keep materials there to supply people that are willing to help us sound the alarm. That includes commercial DVDs. Just got another shipment of an extremely critical documentary to watch called Silent Epidemic. On that same DVD is another critical film. These films are first-rate, absolutely factual, credible, verifiable, informational films. The second film on that DVD now is Making a Killing. That also is essential information about what mainstream medical industrial complex is doing to our children with the kinds of medication they are passing on, in addition to the now proven toxic with peer-reviewed study vaccinations. Proven toxic with peer-reviewed science study. What will it take to wake the American population up, the world population indeed, to what's being done to them? Watch these films, find out what you did not know. Again, free DVDs at Orchard Nutrition. If you care, you have a responsibility to find out what's going on and to make your voice heard in the battle to expose this insanity. On that note, today at Orchard Nutrition from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., the Vax Bus, Vax, the incredibly powerful documentary you can view online for, I believe, $3.99, Vaxxed from Cover-Up to Catastrophe, referring to vaccination safety, again, with top-level CDC scientists, whistleblowers. Thousands of documents proving vaccination dangers have been hidden for decades, trying to present that data to Congress. Congress won't let them. The Vax film crew bus with the Vax producer and physician Dr. Humphreys with Vax producer Polly Tommy will be at that bus, will be filming some interviews, free materials for the public that geoengineeringwatch.org will provide at a booth there. Also, geoengineeringwatch.org will have a booth at this event. Again, Orchard Nutrition today from 11 to 3 with free informational materials. Come and find out what you don't know. I'll be there as well from about 12 to 3. We'll have lots of activists there to answer questions. Come to Orchard. My thanks to Orchard Nutrition for their courage in helping us to sound the alarm. Again, 11 to 3 p.m. today in Redding at Orchard Nutrition. Also, announcement, July 28th event coming up. It's a little way away, but we want to make sure everybody knows what's going to happen that day. July 28th at the Red Line Hotel in Redding, California. I don't have the times laid out yet. I'll post flyers of this event soon. But the speakers at that event, it'll be a very hard-hitting, fast-moving evening at the Red Line. This is a free public event. The ballroom seats 600. It's free to the public. First come, first serve on the seating. We'll have video TVs feeds into the lobby area in case we have overfill, but there'll be lots of free materials there as well. Speakers, now we have confirmed Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, their leading global voice from a mainstream medicine physician about the proven vaccination dangers. Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, if you don't know who she is, search her online, watch some of her presentations. Also, former decorated CIA officer Kevin Shipp, whistleblower from the CIA, will also be speaking. And I will be giving a presentation, updated frontline data on how dire our biosphere implosion is, how immediate the threat is. All three presentations back to back, all free to the public. July 28th. At the Red Line Hotel in Reading. There'll be flyers out for that soon. I'll post an article about that as well. Moving on to too many stories to cover, as always. We'll go through as many as we can, but I want to cover this. All of us must be discerning in what we decide to share with others. In regard to so-called news stories, we must all know enough or investigate enough to find out if what we're sharing is indeed credible, to see if the dots connect, and to see if there's any way to verify such articles from certain news sources. A case in point from last week. A news story was circulating and going fairly viral with many sites that said Donald Trump promises to stop geoengineering. Within that article was a quote attributed to me that said, based on a phone conversation with Dane Wigington, Trump has taken these steps, and I don't have the direct quote in front of me, and that I stated I would watch over Mr. Trump as if I have the ability to do that and make sure he followed through with his promise. That quote was 100% completely fabricated. And yet this story was circulating around, and with people who unfortunately weren't trying to verify if that story fit with any of the other facts that they should have known. And we all have a responsibility to investigate what we share. That's what I'm saying. So I contacted the site that put this article out, left a phone message that such an egregious false quote carried with it legal liability. A completely fictitious quote for a completely fictitious story. Our attorneys group followed up with this website to confirm that indeed they had created legal liability for themselves by fabricating this quote and attributing it to me. And they promptly removed my name from the story and just put someone else's name in on the story and left the story up and left it circulating. Obviously, completely false. In fact, with the Trump administration, not only are they not stopping climate engineering is being ramped up to ever more extensive levels, catastrophic levels. Our planet and its life support systems are being completely derailed and toxified by covert climate engineering programs. So the bottom line is this: don't bite anything that's dangled before you. Investigate stories before you share them, and don't take things at face value and leap at the first sensationalized, completely false story that crosses your path. Let's get to some real stories now. 10,000 new cases of autism in London a year. 10,000. As bureaucrats plan to dump children from healthcare system. The system is completely overloading because the population is imploding. Our health is imploding. Our mental ability, our cognitive functions are imploding. And is it any wonder, given what we're being exposed to, the fallout from climate engineering from the skies, the toxic elements in vaccinations, our poisoned foods packed with chemicals, a very in-depth story in one moment on that. Is it any wonder that as a species, we're imploding and the system can't handle it? Of course not. 10,000 new cases of autism a year, and we're told it's all normal and everything's fine. Go back to sleep. 40,000% increase in autism since 1975. 40,000% increase. What's it take to wake the population? Again, I hope people in the Shasta County area will come to Orchard Nutrition and make their voice heard, pick up materials that you can share with others today, 10 to 3. Moving on to a story about chemicals, what we're swimming in. We're all in a sea, a toxic soup of what is only a reflection of the human insanity, the human inability to see that we are not just shooting ourselves in the foot, we're shooting ourselves in the head with our behavior on this once thriving planet. The title of this article is "The Earth is Now a Toxic Planet." How true that is. From this report, humans emit more than 250 billion tons of chemical substances a year. Try to get your arms around that. And a toxic avalanche that is harming people and the entire web of life. Earth and all life on it are being saturated with man-made chemicals in an event unlike any other in the planet's history. Every moment of our lives we're exposed to thousands of these substances. With every breath we take, every drink of water, every bite of food, the cosmetics we wear, the things we encounter every day in our home, our workplaces, and travel. The poisoning of the planet through man-made chemical emissions is the largest human impact scenario and the one that is least understood or regulated. Not regulated. For those that think if there were some dangers out there, we would be told not true. Absolutely not true. Official public protection agencies like the EPA, air quality boards, and so on, as I've stated in so many broadcasts, are there to hide the problem, not to disclose it. Continuing with this report, the European Chemicals Agency estimates that there are more than 144,000 man-made chemicals in existence. The U.S. Department of Health estimates 2,000 new chemicals are being released every year. The UN Environmental Program warns most of these have never been screened for human health safety. The world, think about that for a moment. Think about that. Not screened, not tested, just produced and scattered throughout the environment. 144,000 different types of chemicals. The report continues. The World Health Organization estimates that tens of millions of people die every year from diseases caused directly by air and soil pollution, chemical exposures, climate change, and ultraviolet radiation, all of which result from human activity. Let's go to climate change and ultraviolet radiation, this report. Climate change cannot legitimately be discussed without the acknowledgement of climate engineering, something that the unimaginably hypocritical and cowardly environmental community is not addressing. And I know there are exceptions, and to those exceptions I say thank you, but the vast majority of these organizations, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, World Wildlife Federation, and the rest, are not acknowledging the climate engineering elephant in the room because their 501c3s depend on them not seeing this in the skies above our heads, or not talking about it or acknowledging it. That must change. If you're in any of those communities, if you support any of these organizations, stop supporting them, make your voice heard, make them acknowledge this issue. Or everything else they pretend to be doing for the environment is moot. It's moot. If the global climate intervention programs are not exposed and halted, which directly relates to the ultraviolet radiation lethal exposure that all of us face as a direct result of climate engineering, not just climate engineering, we have CFCs, we have countless other causes. I'm not ignoring those, but I'm saying we have mathematically the single greatest cause that's not being acknowledged at all. That has to change. The report continues. Examples of the toxic avalanche we face include manufactured chemicals, 30 million tons. Hazardous waste, this is annually, 40 million tons. Coal, oil, and gas, 15 billion tons. Eroded soils, 75 billion tons. Heavy metals and materials, 75 billion tons. Mining and mineral waste, 200 billion tons. Contaminated waters, 9 trillion tons. Industrial toxins are now routinely found in newborn babies, mother's milk, the food chain, domestic drinking water worldwide. They've been detected from the peak of Mount Everest, where, by the way, the snow is so polluted it doesn't meet drinking water standards, to the depths of the oceans and in the hearts of our cities and in the most remote islands. It's everywhere, everywhere. We have 1,000 whales studied throughout the globe, peer-reviewed study. I've mentioned this on numerous broadcasts also, that contained, the report stated, jaw-dropping levels of aluminum in their tissue. From the most remote places on the planet, they're breathing it. Do any of us think that we're not in the same position? with our bodies being filled with bioaccumulative heavy metals like aluminum? If you don't believe it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you believe. This is a fact. Every human test subject that we test, hair, blood, urine, is packed with heavy metals, starting with aluminum. You can't escape this. When it's raining down through the air column, when it's the number one named element in climate engineering patents, and the stated goal of putting 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticulates into the air annually, as the world's most recognized geoengineer David Keith has stated on the record, of course we're breathing this material. What will it take for the public to stop their golf games and their Super Bowl football parties and face what we must face if we're to preserve any semblance of a future for our children? I want to finish this report on toxic elements in our environment. The mercury found in the fish we eat and in polar bears in the Arctic is fallout from the burning of coal and increases every year. And not just coal. As I've stated also in former broadcasts, climate engineering programs appear to be using coal fly ash as a base material for a number of reasons. Too many to outline here in this program, but that is also a source of mercury over the oceans. And how bad is it? I once, for a period in my life, while I spent, as I've stated on other programs, a lot of time off the California coast to the Channel Islands, subsisting off spearfishing from kelp bass that lived there. This is in the late 80s, and I finally reached a state biologist that was honest with me. This is in the late 80s, who told me, stop eating the fish. This is in a marine park 50 miles out to sea, because even at that time, the fish I was eating was 20 times higher in mercury than the limits, than the stated health limits, which are already high. This is in the 80s. How much worse is it now? Our planet has been completely poisoned, and it's getting worse by the day. Single greatest source of particulate pollution, climate engineering. Final statements from this report. There is global concern at the death of honeybees from agricultural pesticides. Again, this report ignores aluminum. Search bees aluminum and find out the peer-reviewed study we have now stating clearly bees are dying from symptoms that resemble Alzheimer's and dementia from massive aluminum exposure from climate engineering. Because bees are dying 1,000 miles into the wilderness away from farms or any other industrial source. Why? Because of climate engineering fallout. So this report alludes to the honeybee death, continues on with the potential impact on the world food supply from the honeybee die-off, as well as all insect life on birds, frogs, fish, on which in turn depend on insects. The issue of chemical contamination that has largely been overlooked by governments and corporations is that chemicals act in combination. This is called synergistic toxicity. Occur in mixes and undergo constant change. A given chemical may not occur in large enough amounts to pose a risk in one place, but in combination with thousands of other chemicals, it may contribute to a much larger risk to health and safety of the whole population. Again, synergistic toxicity. The bottom line is, industrialized society is totally and completely out of control. The population in first world countries especially that is distracted with every form of material wealth is choosing for the moment to put their heads in the sand, the vast majority, I'm not saying everyone, and my gratitude to those who are not choosing to put their head in the sand, but the vast majority are choosing to go about their material pursuits and ignore the fact that the house is burning down around us. On that note, what is the greatest single driving factor behind the militarized, industrialized society we live in? The U.S. military. And who is trashing the environment like no other? The U.S. military. Here's a headline. U.S. military is the world's largest polluter. Hundreds of bases gravely contaminated. Here are some excerpts from this report. The U.S. Department of Defense is both the nation's and the world's largest polluter, producing more hazardous waste than the 5 largest U.S. chemical companies combined. The U.S. Department of Defense has left its toxic legacy throughout the world in the form of depleted uranium, oil, jet fuel, pesticides, defoliants, like Agent Orange, and lead, among other elements. In 2014, the former head of the Pentagon's environmental program told Newsweek that her office has to contend with 39,000 contaminated areas spread across 19 million acres in just the U.S. alone. U.S. military bases, both domestic and foreign, consistently rank among some of the world's most polluted places in the world, as toxic chemicals like jet fuel, rocket fuel, and other forms of contamination poison our drinking water, aquifers, and soil. Hundreds of military bases can be found on the Environmental Protection Act's list of Superfund sites which qualify for cleanup grants from the government. So the government pollutes it, and the military pollutes, and we pay to clean it up. Continuing from this report, almost 900 of the nearly 1,200 Superfund sites, 3/4 of the Superfund sites in the U.S. are abandoned military facilities or sites that otherwise support military needs, not counting the military bases themselves. Does anybody remember my story from 1 or 2 weeks ago? Now that Greenland is thawing rapidly, we have a nuclear waste dump on Greenland that our military left there in the completely ludicrous belief that it would stay frozen forever and somehow magically never be a problem. This is the mentality of the U.S. military-industrial complex and our citizenry that blindly supports it. Blind patriotism is not patriotism at all. It's tyranny. Report continues, almost every military site in this country is seriously contaminated. John D. Dingell, a retired Michigan congressman and war veteran, told Newsweek. In addition, the U.S., which has conducted more nuclear weapons tests than all other nations combined. Think about that hypocrisy. We threaten to bomb other countries if they test even a missile, but we've tested more nuclear tests than all other nations combined. The U.S. is also responsible for the massive amount of radiation that continues to contaminate many islands in the Pacific Ocean. The Marshall Islands, where the U.S. dropped more than 60 nuclear weapons between 1946 and 1958, are a particularly notable example. Inhabitants of the Marshall Islands and nearby Guam continue to experience an exceedingly high rate of cancer. The U.S. military does not care. They don't care. They don't ask permission. They do whatever they want, and they're doing it in our skies right now. And if you think that they care about the health of U.S. citizens, think again. They don't care about the health of their own soldiers. Those at the top don't care about anything, except, of course, their own personal pursuit of power. Continuing with the report. One of the most recent testaments to the U.S. military's horrendous environmental record is Iraq. The U.S. military action there has resulted in the desertification of 90% of Iraqi territory. Freedom and democracy, that's what we brought to the Iraqis, right? Crippling the country's agriculture industry and forcing it to import more than 80% of its food. The U.S. use of depleted uranium in Iraq during the Gulf War also caused a massive environmental burden for Iraqis. In addition, the U.S. military's policy of using open-air burn pits to dispose of waste from the 2003 invasion has caused a surge in cancer among U.S. servicemen and Iraqi civilians alike. Our military doesn't care what they do to our troops. They don't care. And when you're watching the military recruiting commercials that are so incredibly disgustingly propagandistic, find out the truth before you sign up to serve the empire who doesn't give a damn about you. Find out what you're signing up for. The American Southwest was also the site of numerous nuclear weapons tests that contaminated large swaths of land. Navajo Indian reservations have been polluted by long-abandoned uranium mines, where nuclear material was obtained by U.S. military contractors. As I've stated also on this program, I spoke to the Navy's PR person some years ago who cavalierly told me the U.S. military would be using depleted uranium ammunition for practice off the U.S. North American West Coast. I wonder why everything's dying, and people blame everything on Fukushima, and that's false. Fukushima is a massive problem. I do not downplay that. But know the whole story. Don't run with some conclusion that you haven't properly researched. There are many factors contributing to the massive ocean die-offs all over the globe, extremely dire die-offs. I'll get to more on that in a few moments. But consider all the factors. Consider that so many equations are not simple this or that equations. I say that over and over. Please remember that. Dichotomous thinking does not lead to credible conclusions. You must look at all the factors. So along the massive die-off on the U.S. West Coast, the Navy using depleted uranium ammunition with no regard for the consequences, they never care about the long-term consequences of what they do. That's the cancer that runs the U.S. military-industrial complex and the rest of the military-industrial complex. Not saying other countries are any different. I'm simply saying the U.S. is by far the worst because it's the biggest by far, as big as the next 10 militaries combined. While the U.S. military's past environmental record makes clear that its current policies are absolutely not sustainable, this has by no means dissuaded the U.S. military from openly planning future contamination of the environment through misguided waste disposal efforts. Last November, the U.S. Navy announced its plan to release 20,000 tons of environmental stressors. That's quote stressors. That way they don't have to say environmental waste, including heavy metals and explosives, into the coastal waters off the U.S. Pacific Northwest over the course of this year. Do we hear about those stories from the Record Searchlight or KRCR or any of the other local so-called news outlets? Are they telling us that, oh, by the way, the military in the already dead ocean is going to contribute tens of thousands more tons of toxic waste in addition to radioactive ammunition? It's a wonder anything's alive off our coast, and there's not much alive, by the way. The fisheries are all shut down. Salmon populations have completely crashed. Not going to continue much longer. If you think otherwise, you're not looking at reality. Final statements from this report. The plan laid out in the Navy's Northwest Training and Testing Environmental Impact Statement fails to mention that these stressors, i.e. environmental, industrial waste, toxins, are described by the EPA as known hazards, many of which are highly toxic at both acute and chronic levels. The 20,000 tons of, quote, stressors or industrial waste mentioned in the environmental impact study do not account for the additional 4.7 to 14 tons of highly toxic heavy metals that the Navy plans to release annually from now on into the inland waters along the Puget Sound. And this is simply what they're telling us. How high do you think these numbers really are? They're using the ocean for a toxic waste dump. Our own military using our own waters for a toxic waste dump. Our own military uses our own soldiers as guinea pigs. How many people have seen the historic newsreels of our soldiers with goggles on watching nuclear bombs go off? Do you think they knew that they were going to be irreparably contaminated when our military leaders said, put these goggles on, go out and take a look at the nuclear blast and you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Or the Agent Orange in Vietnam or the depleted uranium. Our military does not care about our soldiers. So if you're blindly waving your flag, pretending you're fighting for freedom and democracy, get a clue. Do some investigation. And I'm not saying there's not good people in the military. There are some very good people in the military. Absolutely. People who have joined for the right motives, but have joined without looking through a clear lens at what they're joining and what they're participating in and what they're facilitating and supporting. So once you hear this news, and I'm not asking anybody to believe me about anything I state, ever. I never ask anyone to believe me, but I am asking you, begging you and pleading with you to investigate. If you have any moral sense of obligation, you must investigate. And once you discover the unpleasant truth on many issues, you have a moral responsibility to act accordingly, to no longer support the insanity. That's a responsibility. It's not an option, it's an obligation. And what's happening with our oceans? Here's a headline. After all I've just stated, consider that with this headline. Oceans are at the edge of losing all oxygen. This is new last week. Event could lead to mass sea extinction that will last at least 1 million years. It will last much longer than that. Paleo data makes that clear. Game over. And it's not leading to mass sea life extinction. That's here now. The oceans are imploding right now. Another headline. Trump is fully unleashing the fossil fuel industrial complex. From Washington, D.C., President Donald Trump today signed an executive order. This is actually going back to April, but I wanted to bring this story into the fray of what I'm discussing here. Trump signed an executive order that directs the U.S. Department of the Interior to study new oil and natural gas drilling off the coast of California, the Atlantic states, Gulf of Mexico, and the Arctic, revising the schedule of proposed oil and gas lease sales to, quote, the maximum extent permitted by law. What does all this mean? It means that this administration and those behind this administration, because Trump is simply, whether he realizes it or not, or whether the public realizes it or not, he's simply a puppet in the play. That's all. But now we see a complete gutting of any sort of tangible environmental protection. And for those that think that's wonderful because it's going to create jobs, and Mr. Trump in fact said this. Trump said about this agreement, which he is signing to gut any environmental protection throughout the Arctic and other regions, he said this: our country is blessed with incredible natural resources, including abundant offshore oil and natural gas reserves. But the federal government has kept 94% of these offshore areas closed for exploration and production. This deprives our country of potentially thousands and thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in wealth, said Trump. I pledge to take action, and today I'm keeping that promise. Back to what I said before I read that quote. For those who think this is wonderful because it's going to create jobs, I would ask you, and I would ask Mr. Trump, how much will those jobs matter on a dead planet? Will it matter at all? When does reason and logic become a part of this equation? That you cannot loot, plunder, and pillage your planet until everything is dead, and then expect to survive yourself. It's a very illogical conclusion. It's time we wake up and dump the programming from all the futuristic movies we've seen that's put out by the power structure industrial complex to program us into believing that somehow technology will magically fix everything. What's technology done for us so far? And I'm not saying there's not valuable technology, but I'm saying as a whole, the worship of technology as some sort of means or measure to save us from all the egregious acts we've inflicted on this planet is a delusional notion. Technology and industrialized society in the geologic blink of an eye has pushed us over the precipice, not to it, but over it. We're in free fall now toward a planet that will not much longer support life. This is a mathematical fact. So for those that are blindly supporting Trump, for those that are blindly supporting the military-industrial complex, you're a part of the problem, as were those who supported blindly Obama, as were those who astoundingly somehow still support Hillary Clinton, who's clearly a criminal, who clearly should be behind bars. I would wager if we knew all there was to know, they would all be behind bars. Trump, Clintons, the Obamas, the Bushes, all of them belong behind bars. When will we stop falling for the facade, the right-left divide and conquer paradigm, all just different sides of the same coin? How many people willing to continue buying into that manufactured facade of distraction while our planet's life support systems implode? I want to finish with this report from Mr. Trump. His executive order prohibits all designations and expansions of national marine sanctuaries. In other words, no more protections, no more protected marine parks, just drill, baby, drill. As Sarah Palin said, another real piece of work that I can't imagine anybody would have supported. The order also lists requirements for exploratory drilling in the Arctic and outer continental shelf. Who cares about any sort of safety precautions? That's what this says. Who cares? Just drill until there's nothing left. It also decimates air quality control and safety requirements in the Gulf of Mexico. The order directs the Secretary of the Interior to implement streamlined permitting approaches for privately funded seismic data collection to determine offshore energy resource potential. Seismic testing is detrimental to whales, of course, not just whales, many other organisms. So let's put this insanity into mathematical context. How many whales, dolphins, and other such organisms might this lifting of the requirement alone kill? How's this for a figure from 2015? As many as 138,000 whales and dolphins along the U.S. Atlantic coast from Delaware to Florida could be injured or killed with this seismic blasting activity. I didn't know there was even that many of those types of mammals left. They're washing up on shores dead everywhere, and it's from all the causes I've already named. Contamination, collapse of the food chain. We have lethal UV levels killing plankton, so the food chain collapses in that manner. Fisheries collapse, nothing to eat. We have depleted uranium ammunition. We have seabed gassing of methane and hydrogen sulfide. We have an ocean that's stratifying, heading toward what's called Canfield Ocean, a lifeless, oxygenless, stratified ocean, polluted again with depleted uranium, with radioactive materials from Fukushima. I could go on and on and on, but what's it all add up to? It adds up to a species, the human race, that the majority of which don't care about this activity that's killing the very planet on which our lives depend. And we must start to care immediately. We'll have nothing left to salvage. And caring involves learning what the frontline facts are, not grabbing the first headline that comes along from some page shill whose job it is to convince us that everything is fine and that we're good and they're bad and that material acquisition is wonderful. That's the American way of life. That's what we should all live for. If you buy into that nonsense, you're absolutely a part of the problem. Don't be a part of the problem. Make the decision to be a part of the cure, not the cancer. I want to read this final quote from Mr. Trump on this report. He said, quote, "I am going to lift the restrictions on American energy and allow this wealth to pour into our communities," said Trump. This wealth. How many communities have been completely destroyed by the energy industry? All over the world, everywhere, from places like the Niger Delta, where we hear about the pirates and so forth that are trying to hijack ships to find something to eat, something to live on, because their whole ecosystems have been completely, in Somalia, completely destroyed by the fossil fuel industry. No fish, nothing's left. South America, the same thing. And Trump is going to do it on an even larger scale to our own country now, and he tries to make us believe, and it's not just Trump, he's only a puppet in the play, but trying to make us believe that this is somehow magically going to make us all wealthy. Everything will be fine. Don't need an environment. Don't need a planet that functions. And Trump, as I stated last week, or those that represent Trump, doubling down on climate engineering, using the divide and conquer tactic by pulling out of the Paris Accord, which didn't really mean much to begin with because it was already toothless, undermined by U.S. lobby, and pulling out of that to create a massive distraction between the environmental communities and those on the other sides of the fence, to keep their eye off of what was really happening, to keep their eye off climate engineering, which is being ramped up to higher levels, to keep business as usual until the last possible second, at which implosion will come like a tornado in the night. It will come. It is coming. In many ways, it's already here. It's simply a matter of hiding it from the American population, pacifying them until the last possible moment, and that's what this statement from Trump is about. Pacifying the American population, that he's going to magically make the wealth flow into our communities, the American dream, the American way of life that the whole world aspires to, without consideration of the fact that on such a trajectory we have no chance. No chance. This statement I've just read from Trump about the wealth flowing into our communities from lifting any and all environmental safety restrictions from the fossil fuel industry is similar to what Trump said after selling the brutal Saudi dictatorship hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons so that the Saudis can continue the slaughter of innocent civilians in Yemen. Creating jobs by contributing to genocide, Mr. Trump, no thank you. As I always state, my disdain for Trump is matched by my disdain for the mainstream media that's pushing the false Trump-Russian connection propaganda, so to speak. It's the same as my disdain for all the other administrations. They're all a part of the cancer. There's many factions of the cancer, many faces on the power structure, but all are still a part of it. We must remember this. About the false economy that's being propped up by printed, fed, fiat money, private bankers. Just a few headlines. For those that think the economy is somehow magically going to get better, look behind the scenes. I'm going to give a few sample headlines, and I must move on to more important issues because the biosphere is the bottom line. Over and over and over, I try to make that point clear. When the biosphere doesn't function, when the natural systems don't function, it's game over. But here's a few headlines for those that think the economy is magically getting better from money printing. Verizon to slash about 2,100 jobs when it closes its Yahoo acquisitions. Saks owner Hudson's Bay is cutting 2,000 jobs. Volkswagen slashing nearly 10,000 workers. Airlines, how are they doing? Cathay Pacific slashing 400 jobs. I could go on and on. We have closed stores all over Northern California. More closing all the time. And at the same time, they're building new stores. Does that make sense? Doesn't make sense. Most of what the human race does from so many perspectives doesn't make sense. Does it make sense to have 144,000 different chemicals floating around our environment with almost no safety study at all? Of course they're not safe. But we have an industry that buys or already owns those who are our, quote, so-called government, like Mr. Trump and those that went before him, that simply do what they're told. Gut environmental protection so that those who crave money and power can continue with their loot, plunder, and pillage policies. And people ask, this is an important question because it's constantly asked, why would they do this to themselves? We can talk about the fossil fuel industry, the military-industrial complex, so forth. Those that are truly at the head of the insanity. Why would they do this to themselves? And as I've stated so many times, does a cancer intend to kill its host? No, a cancer intends to proliferate. It never considers that the host will eventually die. Same mentality. Drug addict. Do they consider that their habit will kill them? No, but they crave the drug. These people crave power and control, and they don't care about the consequences. That's what we're dealing with. So if you convince yourself that none of this is true because the proverbial they, i.e. the central bankers in the end, would not do this to themselves, the denial won't save you. Back to the environment, back to headlines from this week about the state of the environment, which is the true bottom line. First, about the weather that's going on. And depending on where you're at in the continental U.S. especially, you may think that somehow it's magically cooled down, everything's fine. We have to take the opposite position of anybody who says otherwise. Look at the bigger picture. I'm only asking you to look at the bigger picture, especially those that are trying to, or say they're trying to, fight and expose climate engineering. If you're an anti-climate engineering activist and you're not looking at or acknowledging the chemical ice nucleated cooldowns in the equation, which are on an unimaginable scale at this point, moisture is being pumped into the East Coast and in the West Coast, chemical ice nucleation occurring, lowering the temperatures on the surface, as we've seen in Northern California, temperatures go from 100 to over 100, back down to 60, back up to 100, back down to 50 1 or 2 days ago, and we're going back up to 105 in a few days in Northern California with nighttime temperatures of 80 degrees. It's not cooling off at night. Why is it not cooling off? Because of the greenhouse gas buildup, because of methane filling the atmosphere and nitrous oxide, elements that I've covered in previous shows. That's why it's not cooling off at night. Heat can't radiate back out into the planet. If a blanket keeps you warm, 2 or 3 blankets makes you too warm. That's what's happening. It's a complex equation. Climate engineering is creating short-term, highly toxic cooldowns at the cost of a much worsened overall warming. So while the U.S., parts of the U.S. have been chemically cooled, how many people see the sun anymore? Isn't that an obvious one as well? When you block the sun, of course you're going to temporarily cool areas, but you're trapping more heat than you deflect. You're shredding the ozone layer. You're disrupting hydrological cycle. You're contributing to forest burn downs all over the globe. The consequences, which are not considered by the military-industrial complex or the climate engineering complex. So while the short-term cool downs are happening in the U.S. and some other industrialized nations, what's happening around the globe? Here's a headline. No surprise, Iran in crisis mode as mercury shoots up to 56 degrees C, 132 degrees Fahrenheit. From that report, parts of Iran have witnessed temperatures of 56 degrees, which have caused power outages and complicated water supplies amid high consumption. Geoengineering. The Iranian government has been on the floor of the UN stating on the record they know their country is being droughted out by NATO weather modification programs. This is business as usual, as I've stated in previous programs. Every single Middle Eastern country that's been destabilized has experienced a once in 1,000 year drought. Is that a coincidence? No, of course not. NATO and Western power structure climate engineering has cut off their rain. This is business as usual. It's historical fact. Weather warfare is a historical fact. Please search what I'm stating. So with HARP high pressure ionosphere heater installations around the globe, high pressure zones can be created, compressing air, which creates heat. So not only can the climate engineers toxically create a short-term chemical cool down, they can also create immense heat. And they do this in some instances to spin the jet stream clockwise in the northern hemisphere to steer the jet stream. And for other reasons, it's weather warfare, perhaps against Iran, creating immense heat. Let me get on to more headlines. Families scramble for relief as heat scorches Hanoi. Do we hear about that here from the Weather Channel that wants to tell us how cold it is in parts of the U.S., and they don't mention the fact that record-shattering temperatures are happening all over the globe? From that report, a record-setting heat wave of over 40 degrees C in Hanoi has disrupted life around the capital, with some families flocking to anywhere with air conditioning. Another paradox, isn't it? As it gets hotter, we want to generate more power to generate more air conditioning, which generates more overall global heat. The definition of insanity. Geoengineering. More jet aircraft in the air, doing more damage to the atmosphere, generating more heat. Temporary toxic cooldowns in exchange for worsened overall warming. Human insanity. More headlines. Historic heat wave sweeps Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. From that report, the last week of May 2017, the first week of June brought one of the most extraordinary heat waves in world history to Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Do we hear about that here in the U.S.? No. And people in the U.S. that want to wave their global cooling flag and pretend climate engineering isn't happening, hypocrisy on all sides of the fence. Environmentalists talking about the heat but not mentioning climate engineering. We have people fighting climate engineering that won't acknowledge the chemical cool downs are not natural, and they won't acknowledge the heat that's happening all over the globe. They simply pick some location that's just been chemically cooled down and claim that's proof that there's no global warming. All no shortage of hypocrisy to go around on all sides of the fence. Let me finish with this report. The Pakistan Meteorological Department stated an all-time high of 53.5 C. The temperature was later estimated at 54 C. If that is correct, this would be a tie for the highest reliable temperature ever recorded on the planet, and never recorded in this region. Never. Continuing, in the following days, the intense heat moved down to Jordan, where nearly half the stations set their all-time high temperature records. The most important of these records was 50.8 C, 123.4 Fahrenheit, recorded on May 30th in Jordan. These readings tie the national record of the highest temperature ever recorded in Oman. All-time high temperature records being set in countries all over the globe, countries that do not have the massive militaries and cannot compete in the criminal climate engineering cabal, and thus they are experiencing the full brunt of what's happening on our planet. And perhaps some of those temperature records being augmented further by ionosphere heaters, as I've mentioned earlier, like HARP. This is not theory, conjecture, or speculation. Ionosphere heaters can heat the ionosphere, can create high pressure, can create heat domes, and are doing exactly that. The U.S. military has long since confirmed the ability of ionosphere heaters to heat the ionosphere by creating an electrical chain reaction that happens after massively powerful radio frequency transmissions are beamed into it. That electrical chain reaction creates massive heat in the ionosphere. Why would anybody want to do this? All the reasons I've already gone over. It's all about power and control, ultimately, but we will all pay the price if it continues. About heat, and another headline that certainly we don't hear in Northern California, most people don't hear anywhere. Here's the headline. Thousands of fish get, quote, cooked in Puget Sound, Washington after extraordinarily hot weather. From that report, thousands of anchovies washed up on the shores of Puget Sound in Washington last week after hot weather over the weekend changed the feeding patterns of the fish, so said state wildlife officials. Their fish reportedly began to wash up on beaches at Case Inlet near Belfair, Washington, early last week and continued to do so throughout the week. KOMO News reported, quote, "It's sad, it's really sad." Yes, it is sad, and it's just the beginning. Final statement from that report. State fish biologists told the news station the hot weather last weekend prompted the fish to swim closer to the shore to feed on plankton. The oceans are dying. They're absolutely dying, and we're seeing ocean temperatures in many locations 20 plus degrees above normal. Some cases in the Arctic, 25, 28 degrees above normal. These are profound temperatures. And for those that may not remember my stating this in other broadcasts, this is important to remember. A cubic meter of seawater contains 4,000 times the thermal energy of a cubic meter of air. All that matters is that the oceans are superheating. The air will follow. And all the short-term chemical surface cool downs the climate engineers can create will only exacerbate the problem. It will get worse very quickly from here. And the weather will continue to spiral out of control. The weather whiplash will continue. The radical swings from record highs to sometimes record lows, very shallow layer of cold air. Cold air is dense, settles to the surface, so when they create a chemical cool down with atmospheric moisture, it creates a downdraft of cool air that sits on the surface and lowers the mercury and pacifies the population into believing that perhaps it's not all that hot after all. But as those chemical cool downs pass, the record temperatures return, and reality with it. And it will become harder and harder for the climate engineers to create their weather whack-a-mole scenarios, the weather whiplash scenarios, as the climate continues to superheat, and most especially as the oceans continue to superheat. Next week, I'll get to a report from a Gulf Stream pilot that's given me some points that he is allowing me to share about the temperatures they're seeing at altitude. Shockingly high temperatures, and their aircraft have been forced to descend from some higher altitudes because the temperatures outside were so extraordinarily warm that there was not enough air density to carry their aircraft. I'll get to some of that report next week. Final headlines. The worst storm ever hits Cape Town, killing 8 and affecting millions of people. Now consider this. While we had the worst storm ever, dropping more than 50 millimeters of rain in some areas and triggering massive waves, in Cape Town, a stone throw away, we had wildfires raging while they're having massive rains and floods. Now, isn't this becoming the norm? Florida was just burning to the ground. Now they're being flooded. This is a sign of a climate system that's completely unraveling. And there are many, many causes. This is where we all must look at, accept, and understand reality. Any form of anthropogenic activity that affects the energy balance of the planet is a form of geoengineering. Intentional geoengineering is the most destructive act ever engaged in by the human race. So all of these things are a factor. But the climate is blowing apart now. It's blowing apart. A few more headlines before I run out of time. Mystery as the magnificent northern gannets, magnificent bird, on the Massachusetts South Shore and Cape Cod are washing up dead or ill. Scientists are stumped. Scientists are always stumped because they won't acknowledge the truth, because they're paid not to acknowledge the truth. We have to remember that. So we have academia betraying the human population in the web of life over and over and over again. Another headline, unbearable heat in India as temperatures hover around 120 degrees Fahrenheit in an unprecedented heat wave. Look it up. Don't believe me. Look it up. That's all I've ever asked of anyone, is to investigate the facts you're presented with. Investigate for yourself. And if you want to know how bad it really is, search this. 2017 mass animal die-off list, mass animal death list. You'll find a list that will shock you of the mass die-offs that are happening all over the globe. And as I've stated before so many times, the geopolitical headlines are directly connected to our imploding biosphere and the quest for resources. I'm running out of time. I want to finish with this. Don't allow yourself to be distracted by the mainstream media theater that's created to keep a population divided and confused and not looking at what really matters. The imploding biosphere and the fact that those in power are pushing us toward certain near-term omnicide. Find out what's happening in the world by looking at independent data and comparing it from multiple sources. I don't ask you to believe me. I'm simply asking to investigate. The military-industrial complex exists by creating conflict all over the globe. We live in an empire now that's trying to expand in desperation, as all empires do as they begin to collapse. And the empires of the United States, the UK, Saudi Arabia, they're all beginning to collapse. They're more dangerous now than ever before. The time for profound changes in our collective philosophies is here. We must overturn our societal programming and accept, or rather embrace, the fact that we're here for a purpose. And that purpose is not to spend our lives in endless pursuit of our own personal pleasures while turning two blind eyes to the horrific and accelerating injustices around the world. A true sense of purpose in this life exists in fully committing oneself to the fight for the greater good, to the effort of preserving what's yet left of our planet's life support systems, to salvaging some semblance of a future for our children to whom we owe our lives. Find out how you can help make your voice heard while it still matters. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org.